Before we begin, if you're new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Now drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story reaches. I'll be reading every single one. In 5 territories, they told stories about the king of Vaelthorn the way people tell stories about weather. Not because weather can be reasoned with, but because understanding it might give you enough warning to get inside before it arrived. They said he was the last of the bone wolf line, the oldest and most savage bloodline in the known wolf world, crossed with Night Vale vampire blood that had no business running in a wolf's veins. They said the combination had produced something the world had no proper name for, something that ruled Vaelthorn with absolute precision for 29 years and had never, not once, found a bond mate, because the demon in him refused everything offered to it and the mating ceremonies had become elaborate, expensive theater that everyone attended and no one believed in anymore. They said when the moon rose, you ran. 7 mating ceremonies, 6 packs, hundreds of omegas presented with careful ceremony and dismissed without explanation. The most feared king in 5 territories, wealthy beyond calculation, powerful beyond challenge, and utterly, completely alone. What they did not say, because they did not know yet, was that his bond mate was 3 miles away in Dravenmoor House, the only human in a building full of wolves, surviving on invisibility and instructions. Her name was Moana Ellis. She followed her instructions exactly. Vaelthorn Palace did not ease you in. There was no gentle introduction, no gradual acclimatization to its scale. You came through the outer gates and it simply happened to you all at once. The sheer vertical ambition of the stone towers, the courtyards that could have swallowed Dravenmoor House 3 times over, the corridors that went on long enough to make you forget what you had been walking toward by the time you reached the end of them. Everything was expensive in the particular way of things that have been expensive for so long they no longer think about it. Stone floors worn smooth by centuries of feet. Tapestries so old their colors had mellowed into something richer than the original. Torches in iron brackets that were themselves works of craft, stamped with the Dravenmoor crest. A bone-white wolf mid-shift, one eye silver, one eye crimson, caught in the exact moment of becoming something other than itself. Moana noticed the crest everywhere. She noticed most things. It was the skill that had kept her functional for 4 years at Dravenmoor House, where reading a room accurately was the difference between a manageable day and a very bad one. She catalogued Vaelthorn Palace the way she catalogued every new environment, exits, hierarchies, the unwritten rules that governed who walked where and looked at whom and how. The hierarchy here was legible within hours. The senior staff moved with the confidence of people who had survived long enough to understand the exact boundaries of their authority and intended to remain within them permanently. The junior maids moved in a register she recognized. Heads down, tasks completed with quiet efficiency, conversations conducted in low voices and truncated the moment anyone senior came within earshot. The warriors were a different category entirely, enormous and contained, occupying their bodies with the particular economy of people who have learned to take up exactly as much space as the situation requires and no more. Everyone, without exception, moved differently in the East Corridor. She noticed it on her second day. A senior maid named Petra, efficient, not unkind, the sort of person who conveyed information in the form of statements rather than explanations, was showing her the household layout when they reached the junction where the main corridor branched left toward the east wing. Petra's pace changed. Not dramatically, but Moana noticed the slight forward lean, the almost imperceptible acceleration, the way Petra's eyes moved to the east corridor entrance and then away again with the practiced speed of someone who had made a habit of not looking directly at something. "East wing is not on your rotation," Petra said without being asked. "All right," Moana said. "It won't be on your rotation." "Understood." Petra moved on. The subject closed behind her like a door. Moana filed it carefully and asked no further questions, because questions about things people had already decided not to explain were rarely answered and occasionally punished. She asked Dara instead. The junior made 2 rooms down from her quarters, on her 3rd evening. Dara was 17 and had been at the palace for 8 months. Long enough to have shed the worst of her initial terror and replaced it with a functional wariness. She looked at Moana when the east wing came up and said, simply, "Moon Nights," and then looked back at her mending as though this were a complete sentence. For Dara, Moana supposed it was, she saw the king for the first time on her 5th day. She was crossing the upper gallery above the great hall, a shortcut Petra had shown her, faster than the main corridor for linen deliveries, when the doors below opened and the court that had been in quiet, productive conversation simply stopped. Not all at once. In a wave, spreading outward from the entrance, conversations ending and bodies straightening, and the specific quality of the room's attention reorganizing itself around a single point. Kael Dravenmoor walked through his own court the way weather moves through a landscape, not aggressively, not with any apparent effort, simply with the absolute physical certainty of something that reshapes whatever it passes through. He was taller than she had expected, though she should have expected it. Bone-white hair, the Dravenmoor crest on his armor in worked silver. His eyes, even at this distance, had a quality she couldn't immediately categorize. Silver-gray with something at the edges, something that caught the torchlight differently than it should. He didn't look up at the gallery. He had no reason to. She was a maid with a linen delivery and he was the king, and these were simply two different categories of existence. She looked away first and kept walking and filed him under the same category as the east corridor. Something to be aware of, something to maintain precise and respectful distance from, something that did not require closer examination to understand the fundamental message of. She encountered Vaelthorn on her 6th day, in the corridor outside the senior advisor's wing. Sable was extraordinary looking, the kind of beauty that announces itself and then waits, patient and accustomed to acknowledgement. Dark hair, pale skin, a face composed with the particular precision of someone who understood that composure was itself a form of power. She looked at Moana the way she might look at a piece of furniture that had been placed slightly incorrectly. Not offensive enough to report, not interesting enough to engage with, simply a minor misalignment in the environment she moved through. Her gaze went to Moana's unmarked neck, stayed there for 1 second, assessing, then moved on. She walked away without speaking. Moana stood in the corridor and felt the specific quality of that dismissal. Not hostile, not cruel. Simply total. She had been assessed, categorized, and filed under irrelevant with the efficiency of someone who had done this calculation many times and trusted her own arithmetic completely. On her 7th day, the assignment sheet arrived with her rotation. She didn't look at it until evening. When she did, she ran her finger down the list, dates, wings, specific rooms, with the careful attention she gave every instruction. Her finger stopped. She read the East Wing assignment twice, then a 3rd time. Then she set the sheet down on her small desk and sat very still for a while, looking at nothing, doing the particular internal calculation of a person deciding whether to report an error or follow an instruction. She had spent 4 years learning that questioning instructions caused more problems than following them. She went to sleep. The sheet sat on the desk. And in the household manager's office 3 corridors away, the error that had produced it sat undiscovered in a stack of paperwork, patient and unassuming, waiting for the moon. The East Wing corridor was wrong in a way she felt before she understood. Not dangerous wrong in any visible sense. No obvious signs, no physical barrier. Nothing she could have pointed to and named. Just the quality of the silence, which was different from the silence of empty corridors elsewhere in the palace. Those silences were simply absences. Rooms between activities, spaces between people. This silence was a presence in itself. It had weight and texture and the specific held-breath quality of something that knew it was being approached. The torches were lit. She noticed this because it argued against what her body was telling her. Someone had maintained this corridor, someone had come here recently enough to tend the lights, which meant her assignment was not entirely anomalous, which meant she was probably overreacting, which meant she should keep walking. She kept walking. The door at the end was the one on her sheet. She verified the number twice. She shifted the cleaning supplies to her left arm, freed her right hand, placed it on the handle. The sound that came through the wood was not a sound she had a name for. She opened the door anyway because the alternative was going back to explain why she hadn't, and explanations required admitting she had disobeyed an instruction, and 4 years of survival had made instruction following as reflexive as breathing. The room was enormous. High ceilings, dark stone. A window that faced directly east and admitted a column of moonlight so sharp and concentrated it seemed almost structural. A pillar of silver holding the ceiling up. The furniture had been pushed to the walls. She registered this detail with the part of her brain that kept cataloging even when the rest of it had stopped functioning entirely, because in the center of the moonlight column, where the silver light was most total and most absolute, was the king. What was happening to him was not something she had language for. She would try, later, to describe it to herself and find that the words kept sliding off the reality of it. He was shifting, she understood that much, but not in any way the other maids had described shifts, which they spoke of as rapid and complete, a man becoming a wolf in a handful of seconds. This was something else. The bone-wolf hybrid nature had its own geography, its own tempo. The bone-white hair had spread, or perhaps grown, or perhaps the distinction between his hair and something older and more structural had simply dissolved. His eyes, which she had seen from the gallery 5 days ago as silver-gray, were completely, uniformly crimson. His hands, she could see them from the doorway, had changed in ways that were not paws and were not hands anymore but something that existed with complete authority in the space between. He turned toward her. Her legs stopped working. This was not bravery. She understood that clearly, in the part of her mind still capable of clarity. She was not standing her ground because she had decided to. She was standing her ground because her body had received the signal to run and simply failed to execute it, the way a very old command fails in a system under too much load. She stood in the doorway with her cleaning supplies and watched the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered in her life orient itself toward her completely, and she could not move. He crossed the room. Not quickly. This was the detail that her mind returned to afterward, again and again, unable to fully process it. He didn't lunge. He didn't charge. He moved with the slow, absolute deliberateness of something that has no need for speed because speed implies the possibility of the target escaping, and that possibility did not appear to be a variable he was calculating. He circled her once, at a distance of perhaps 4 feet, and the crimson eyes moved over her with an attention that was not the attention of a predator assessing prey. It was something else, something she had no framework for. He stopped in front of her, closer than the 4 feet, closer than was survivable by any rational measure. She could feel the heat of him. The hybrid shift generated something beyond normal body temperature, something that pressed against her skin like a physical thing. He bent his head toward her neck. She stopped breathing. What happened next was not gentle. She would not remember it as gentle, and she would not forgive anyone who described it that way, because softening it would dishonor the reality of what it was. Something ancient and total and absolutely without her input, a claiming that predated every social structure and every designation hierarchy and every rule the wolf world had constructed to manage exactly this kind of moment. It hurt. The bite was deep and certain and irrevocable, and the sound he made when it happened was not a sound she would be able to reproduce or describe. But it was not cruel. This was the distinction she would return to in the weeks that followed, when she was trying to understand what had happened to her. Cruelty required indifference to the other person's experience. What she felt from him, through the bond that snapped open the moment his teeth found the mark, the bond that flooded her system with something warm and enormous and absolutely certain, was the precise opposite of indifference. He knew she was there. He knew exactly who he had chosen. The bond held her through what followed the way deep water holds a person. Not comfortably, not without pressure, but completely. She did not break. She did not understand why she did not break, because by every rule she knew about human bodies and wolf claiming, she should not have survived it. She survived it. The bond held. She woke in a room she didn't recognize. The ceiling was high and unfamiliar. The bed was softer than anything she had slept in her life. She was wearing a plain linen shift that was not hers. Someone had changed her clothes, which she processed with the distant, floating quality of a mind still reassembling itself from scattered pieces. Her cleaning supplies were gone. The moonlight through the window was different, lower, later, the moon passed its peak and descending. She raised her hand to her neck. The mark was raised and precise against her skin, already healed to the smoothness of something permanent. She pressed 2 fingers against it and felt the bond respond. A low, steady warmth, like a sound too deep to hear but possible to feel in the sternum. She lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room in clothes that belonged to someone else, and took a careful inventory of her body, and found it whole. Then she stared at the ceiling and began, with the methodical practicality of a person who has survived every bad thing so far by thinking rather than feeling, to calculate what came next. The mark on her neck was something every wolf in the palace would be able to read. She had until morning before the world changed entirely. She couldn't cover it. She tried, with the methodical practicality that had gotten her through every difficult morning of the last 4 years. The linen shift had a collar but not high enough. She had no scarf, no wrap, nothing that belonged to her in this unfamiliar room except the clothes she had arrived in, which had been removed and replaced and were nowhere she could find. She spent 10 minutes searching with quiet efficiency before accepting that the mark was going to be visible and that the 10 minutes had been a form of bargaining she couldn't afford. She found her original clothes folded on a chair by the door. Cleaned, she noticed, which was a detail she filed without knowing yet what to do with. She dressed. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she opened it and walked into whatever came next, because the alternative was staying in the room indefinitely, and that had never been an option available to her. The corridor outside was staffed. A senior palace attendant she hadn't met was stationed directly opposite the door with the specific quality of presence that meant stationed rather than coincidentally present. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify, not unkind, not warm, purely professional in the manner of someone who has been given instructions and intends to follow them precisely. "The household manager will see you," he said. "This way." The household manager's name was Edra. She was a compact, silver-haired woman of approximately 60 who had survived in her position through 4 kings and what Moana estimated must have been an extraordinary quantity of diplomatic adaptability. She looked at Moana when she entered, and her eyes went immediately and without apparent self-consciousness to the mark on Moana's neck, and she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone performing a rapid internal recalculation. Not horror, not sympathy. The specific expression of a woman rearranging her understanding of the relevant power structure with the pragmatic efficiency of someone for whom accurate information is a professional tool. "Sit down," Edra said. Moana sat. "You understand what the mark means." "I understand that every wolf in the palace can read it." "Yes." Edra looked at her for another moment. "Your previous room assignment is no longer appropriate. Your rotation is suspended. You will be moved to the guest quarters in the south wing by this afternoon." She paused. "Do you have questions?" Moana had approximately 40 questions. She selected the most functional one. "What am I now?" Edra considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That," she said carefully, "is currently above my authority to determine." She stood, which indicated the meeting was complete. "Stay in the south wing. Don't go anywhere you haven't been directed to go. Someone will come for you." By afternoon the south wing felt different from the rest of the palace, not in any physical way, but in the quality of attention that followed Moana through it. Staff who passed her in the corridor looked at her neck and then looked away with varying degrees of speed and discretion. Some managed neutral. Some managed almost neutral. One young maid she hadn't met looked at the mark and then at Moana's face with an expression of such naked astonishment that Moana nearly said, "I know," just to acknowledge the shared absurdity of the situation. Word traveled in the precise way Edra's expression had told her it would. Efficiently, thoroughly, and faster than Moana's ability to get ahead of it. She didn't see Sable until evening. She heard her first, the particular quality of measured footsteps that belonged to someone who moved through spaces as though the spaces had been arranged for their benefit. Then Sable appeared at the end of the south wing corridor, alone, which Moana understood immediately was deliberate. No witnesses was a choice, not an accident. Sable stopped at a distance of perhaps 8 feet. She looked at Moana with those composed, assessing eyes, and then at the mark and then back at Moana's face. The silence lasted long enough to be architectural, built and intentional and load-bearing. There was no explosion, no accusation, no raised voice, no visible fracture in the beautiful composed surface of her. This was the thing that made the back of Moana's neck tighten with something more precise than fear. An explosion she could have tracked and anticipated. What Sable's face showed instead was a woman absorbing new information, repositioning her pieces on a board she had been playing for years, and beginning to calculate her next move with the calm of someone who has never seriously considered the possibility of losing. She looked at Moana for one more moment. Then she turned and walked away, and the corridor felt colder after she left it than it had before she arrived. The summons came an hour later. Formal, written, carried by the same senior attendant from the morning. The throne room. Immediately, Moana read it once, set it down, and took exactly the amount of time required to ensure her face was composed before she followed him. The throne room of Vaelthorn Palace was the kind of space designed to remind visitors of their scale relative to the institution they were standing in. The ceiling was vaulted and distant. The stone was older than the rest of the palace, darker, worn in patterns that suggested centuries of specific use. The Dravenmoor crest repeated along both walls in carved relief, the bone-white wolf midshift, one eye silver, one eye crimson. Kael stood at the far end. Not on the throne. In front of it, which she understood without being told was a meaningful distinction. This was not a formal audience, it was something else, something that hadn't been categorized yet. He was in full court dress without the armor, which made him look simultaneously more human and less approachable. The silver-gray eyes found her the moment she entered and stayed on her as she crossed the room, and they were completely controlled in the way that things are controlled when a considerable amount of effort is being applied to making them so. She stopped at the appropriate distance and waited. He looked at her for a moment at the mark, then at her face with the focused attention of a man taking precise inventory. Then he spoke, and his voice had the quality she remembered from the gallery, from the way it had rearranged the air in the great hall simply by entering it. "You are under my protection," he said. "This is not a discussion." She held his gaze. "I wasn't going to argue." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not softness, not quite. More like the adjustment of something that had been braced for a specific kind of resistance and encountered a different one. He studied her for another moment. "The council will want to meet with you," he said. "You will not meet with them without me present. The household staff have been instructed regarding your status. If anyone in this palace gives you cause for concern." He paused, with the precision of a man selecting his words for maximum accuracy. "You will tell me." "All right," she said. Another fractional pause. She had the distinct impression he had expected more protest, more visible fear, more of the particular deference that his court performed reflexively in his presence. She wasn't performing deference. She was doing the same thing she had done in Edra's office and in the South Wing corridor and in every difficult room of the last 4 years. She was being completely still and completely present and giving nothing away that she didn't choose to give. He looked at her as though she were a document he was reading very carefully. "You're human," he said. "Not an accusation. An observation, precise and unornamented. Yes. You survived the marking." Apparently, the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. It was simply a silence. Two people in a large room, taking the measure of a situation neither had planned for. "You'll be moved to permanent quarters today," he said finally. "Edra will handle the arrangements." He turned slightly, which she understood was dismissal, and then stopped. "Your name?" "Moana," she said. "Moana Ellis." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Ellis. It was my mother's name. She's gone." Another pause. Something moved behind the controlled silver-gray eyes, brief and unidentifiable and gone before she could name it. "Go with the attendant," he said. "You'll be informed of what comes next." She went. At the threshold she paused, which she hadn't planned to do, and looked back. He was still standing in front of the throne watching her leave, and his expression had changed in some way she couldn't categorize. Something that was not cold, in a face that had been cold since she entered. She filed it, walked out, kept her breathing even all the way down the corridor. Then she found the nearest alcove, stepped into it, pressed her back against the stone wall, and stood there for 60 seconds doing absolutely nothing, because even she had limits, and she had just reached one. She had been given 3 rooms. This was disorienting in a way she hadn't anticipated. At Greymore House she had shared a dormitory with 11 other girls and had a shelf, not a drawer, for her possessions. Her first week at the palace had given her a single small room with a narrow bed and a window that faced the inner courtyard. 3 rooms felt like a category error, like being handed a document written in a language she technically spoke but had never been required to read. She walked through them twice on the first evening, taking inventory the way she took inventory of everything, and found a sitting room with chairs she was uncertain she was allowed to use, a bedroom with a bed so large it seemed to be making a philosophical point, and a small adjoining room that appeared to serve no purpose she could immediately identify except to exist as evidence of excess. Everything was clean. Everything was good quality. Nothing felt like it had anything to do with her. She sat on the edge of the large bed, which was the one piece of furniture that seemed to have a clear function, and thought about the throne room and the mark on her neck and Sable's cold corridor assessment, and the specific quality of Kael's voice when he said this is not a discussion, and eventually concluded that thinking was not going to resolve any of it tonight and she should sleep. She did not sleep. She was sitting in one of the chairs she was uncertain about, in the sitting room, at some late hour she couldn't determine because she didn't have a clock and the window showed only the dark inner courtyard, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She recognized them before she understood how she recognized them. The bond she was discovering had its own information system, a low, constant warmth in her sternum that registered his proximity the way skin registers temperature, not as a thought but as a fact. She sat very still. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A pause, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be hesitation exactly. More like a person arriving at a door and taking a moment to determine whether knocking was the appropriate action or an overcorrection. He knocked. 2 sounds. Quiet. She crossed the room and opened the door. Kael stood in the corridor in what she was coming to understand were his informal clothes. Plain dark tunic, no crown, no armor, which did not make him look less imposing so much as differently imposing. The silver-gray eyes found her face and stayed there with the focus quality she was already beginning to identify as simply how he looked at things he was trying to understand. "You're awake," he said. "So are you," she said. A pause. He looked past her into the sitting room. A brief, assessing glance, and then back. "The rooms are adequate. They're very large." "Yes." He seemed to consider this. "You can request different furniture. If the existing pieces are—" He stopped, with the slight quality of a person who has started a sentence and discovered partway through that they are less certain of its destination than they thought. "Edra handles the household requests." "The chairs are fine," she said. "I was sitting in one. At this hour. I don't sleep well in new places." She wasn't sure why she told him that. It was true, but truth was something she distributed carefully, in quantities calibrated to what the situation required, and the situation did not obviously require this particular truth. It came out with the slightly unguarded quality of words produced by a person who is very tired and has run low on the energy required to edit themselves. He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the air of a man making a decision he is not entirely certain about, he said, "May I come in?" It was not quite a question, not quite a command either. Something genuinely in between, which she suspected was unfamiliar territory for him. She stepped back from the door. He came in and stood in the center of the sitting room, which was a large room that nonetheless managed to feel smaller with him in it, and looked at the chair she had been sitting in and the general evidence of a person existing in a space without having fully committed to it yet. Nothing unpacked, nothing placed, everything still in its provided position as though she hadn't decided whether she was staying. He sat down. Not in her chair, in the one adjacent to it, which was a choice she noted without commenting on. She sat back down in her own. The sitting room was quiet. The courtyard outside was dark. Neither of them spoke for a moment, which was strange and also, she found, not unbearable. "You didn't react," he said. "The way people usually react to me. In the throne room? In general." She considered this honestly. "I was reacting. I'm just quiet when I do it." Something almost moved across his face. "Most people perform their fear. It's useful. I always know what I'm working with." He looked at her steadily. "You don't perform anything. I found it doesn't help." "No," he said, with the weight of someone agreeing from experience. "It doesn't." Another silence. This one had a slightly different quality. Less like two people waiting for something and more like two people who have unexpectedly arrived at the same location from different directions and are taking a moment to establish that they are, in fact, in the same place. "7 mating ceremonies," he said abruptly. Not to her exactly, more to the middle distance, with the tone of a man producing a fact that has been sitting in him and has decided, without his full authorization, to come out. 7 years. Every eligible omega in 6-packs. His jaw tightened slightly. "The demon in me found all of them." He paused, selecting the word with precision. "Unconvincing." She said nothing. She had learned that silence, correctly deployed, was an invitation that people frequently accepted. "I don't have a framework for this," he said. The admission was flat and unornamented, delivered with the particular quality of someone who has decided that honesty is more efficient than performance. "I have never," he stopped. "There is no existing protocol for a human mate. The council knows this. My advisors know this. Everyone in this palace is currently determining what it means, and none of them are asking me." "What does it mean to you?" she asked. He looked at her. The question had landed differently than she'd intended. She had asked it the way she asked most things, direct and without decoration, and it seemed to have caught him at an angle he hadn't prepared a surface for. "No one has asked me that," he said. "I'm asking." The silver-gray eyes held hers for a moment with the focused, reading quality she was becoming familiar with. Something moved behind them. Not the brief, unidentifiable flicker from the throne room. Something slower and more structural. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "That's an honest answer." "I know," she said. "It's the one I wanted." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you not more afraid of me?" She thought about this seriously because he had asked it seriously and he deserved a real answer. "I am," she said. "I'm afraid of quite a lot about this situation." She looked at her hands, at the mark she could feel without seeing it. "But you're also the only person in this palace who has been straightforward with me since I arrived. That counts for something." He said nothing, but the way he looked at her shifted. Some small internal revision, a recalibration happening quietly behind his controlled face. As though he had been reading a document he thought he understood and had found a line that required him to go back to the beginning. They sat in the sitting room in the dark for a while longer, not talking, not performing anything for each other. And it was the most honest Moana had felt since she walked through Vaelthorn's outer gates. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "The room adjacent to the bedroom," he said. "It's traditionally used as a reading room. There's a library 2 corridors east if you want books." He left before she could respond. She sat in the chair that she was uncertain she was allowed to use, in rooms that were too large for her, with a mark on her neck that had rearranged the entire architecture of her life. She thought, "He asked if I was afraid and actually waited for the answer." She thought, "No one has done that before." She did not sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the one before. The missing items were documented with impressive thoroughness. 3 pieces from the East Wing silver collection. A serving ladle, 2 decorative cups, items of moderate value but significant symbolic weight given their location and their association with the restricted corridor. An inventory discrepancy in the south wing linen closet that placed the deficit in the week of Moana's arrival. A written statement from a junior staff member, signed and dated, attesting to having seen a figure matching Moana's description in a corridor she had no assigned reason to be in, on an evening she had no alibi for because she had spent it alone in her 3 rooms not sleeping. She found out about it the way she found out about most things at Vaelthorn, not through official communication but through the quality of the silence that preceded official communication. Dara stopped meeting her eyes in the corridor on the first day. On the second day, the senior attendant who had been assigned to her south wing quarters developed a habit of being elsewhere when she appeared. By the third day, the atmosphere had the specific texture of a place where everyone knows something that one person doesn't, and the one person is starting to be able to feel it. The summons from the household council arrived on the 4th morning. It was formally worded, precisely dated, and careful not to use the word accused anywhere in its text, which told her everything she needed to know about how the next hour was going to be conducted. She read it twice, set it down, and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table in front of her, doing the calculation she had learned to do in every bad situation. What do I have? What do I need? What is actually true? And how do I present what is actually true to people who have already decided it isn't? She went. The household council chamber was smaller than the throne room and more suffocating for it. A low-ceilinged room with a long table, 5 council members arranged on one side of it with the documentation spread before them in the organized manner of people who have prepared their position in advance. Elder Voss was present, which told her this had been elevated beyond household administration. Darian sat at the far end with his hands folded and his expression calibrated to the specific neutrality of a man who is not leading the proceeding and wants it noted that he is not leading the proceeding. She sat in the single chair on the opposite side of the table and looked at the documentation they presented her and took her time reading it, because rushing through evidence was what people did when they were afraid of what it said, and she was not going to perform fear for this room. The evidence was good. She acknowledged this internally with the honest practicality she applied to all assessments. The inventory discrepancy was real. She could not explain it because she had not caused it, and the absence of an explanation was itself being used as evidence. The staff statement was specific and confident. The silver collection record placed the deficit in a window that included her first week, when her movements had not been monitored or documented in any way that could contradict the account being offered. Elder Voss spoke first, with the measured cadence of a man presenting an argument he considers irrefutable. The situation was delicate, he said. The king's, he paused carefully here, attachment to the girl was understandable given the circumstances of the marking. But the household had a responsibility to the integrity of the palace, and a human with no pack affiliation, no verifiable history, and now a documented record of theft. The record documents a discrepancy, Moana said. Not theft. Voss stopped. The inventory shows missing items. It doesn't show me taking them. Those are different things. She kept her voice level, factual. The same register she had used in every room that had tried to reach a conclusion about her before she had finished speaking. The staff statement places a figure matching my description in a corridor. I'd like to know which corridor and which evening, because if I can account for my location that evening with any specificity, the statement becomes significantly less useful as evidence. A slight shift around the table. Not in her favor. She wasn't naive enough to believe the shift was in her favor. But the shift of people who had expected a different kind of response and were recalibrating their approach. Darian said nothing. He was watching her with the assessing quality he brought to everything, filing information she couldn't see him filing. Voss began again, patient and persistent, the tone of a man who understands that a reframe is not a refutation. The council's concern was not punitive, he said, simply procedural. A human in an unprecedented position within the royal household created structural questions that required, dismiss this, right now. The voice came from the threshold. No announcement. No attendant preceding him. Kael simply appeared in the doorway of the council chamber in the way that weather appears, suddenly present. having been absent a moment before, rearranging the atmosphere of the room without apparent effort. He took in the scene in a single assessment: the table, the documentation, the 5 council members, Moana in the single chair on the wrong side of all of it. And his expression did not change because his expression was already set to something that did not require adjustment for this situation. The silence was total and immediate. Voss opened his mouth. I said dismiss it. Not louder. Simply final, in the way that certain statements are final. Not because of their volume but because of the absolute absence of any negotiating position contained within them. His eyes moved to the documentation on the table. Remove that from the record. All of it. No one spoke. One by one, with the careful movements of people who have calculated their options and found them limited, the council members began gathering the papers from the table. Darian watched without expression. Voss held Kael's gaze for approximately 3 seconds, which Moana suspected was longer than most people managed, and then looked down at his hands. Kael's eyes moved to her. A brief, complete assessment. Then he stepped back from the threshold without a word, which she understood was instruction rather than departure. She stood, pushed in her chair with the same unhurried quiet she had sat in it with, and walked out of the council chamber. He was in the corridor, not waiting exactly, but present in the deliberate way he had been present outside her rooms at midnight. He fell into step beside her, and they walked in silence for a full corridor length before he spoke. Tell me when it happens again. She noticed the word. Filed it. Not if. Not if, he confirmed. He said it without particular emphasis, the flat certainty of a man stating a fact about a territory he knows well. I know this court. I know what it does when it wants something removed and cannot do it directly. His jaw tightened once, briefly. Sable has been playing this game since she was 17 years old. Moana considered this. You knew it was her. I know what her work looks like. He stopped walking, which caused her to stop also, and turned to look at her with the focused silver-gray attention she was becoming familiar with. You didn't tell me she had spoken to you in the South Wing corridor. I didn't think it was reportable. She didn't say anything. What she doesn't say is how she operates. He studied her for a moment. You're very good at reading rooms. You read people accurately. You understood what that documentation was before the council finished presenting it. A pause. Why didn't you send for me? She thought about the honest answer. Then she gave it because he had established a pattern of receiving honest answers and she had found it surprisingly sustainable. Because I've been handling rooms like that alone for 4 years. It didn't occur to me that I didn't have to. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who didn't have a response. It was the silence of one who had received information that required a moment of internal processing before it could be answered. It occurs to you now, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said. It occurs to me now. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned and continued walking, and she fell back into step beside him, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the corridor. But the distance between them, she noticed, was slightly less than it had been before. The weeks that followed had a different texture than anything before them. Not easier exactly. The court was still a place of careful navigation. Sable's presence still registered in every room like a barometric shift, and Moana's position remained technically unprecedented in ways that the council reminded everyone of at regular intervals. But something had changed in the architecture of her days, and she was still in the process of identifying what. Kael began appearing. Not dramatically, not with announcement or apparent intention. He simply developed a habit of being in spaces she was also in, the East Library in the late morning, the inner courtyard on the afternoons she had taken to walking its perimeter for the particular meditation of covering known ground, the corridor outside her rooms at hours that suggested he had not been sleeping. He rarely initiated conversation. He would arrive, occupy a chair or a section of wall, and exist in the same space she was existing in with the calm, deliberate quality of a man who has decided to be somewhere and sees no reason to justify the decision. She had initially interpreted this as monitoring. She had revised this interpretation by the end of the second week because monitoring had a different quality. It watched for specific things. It had an agenda visible in the quality of attention. What Kael did was something else. He watched her the way people watch things they are genuinely curious about, with the open, patient quality of someone who has no predetermined conclusion and is simply collecting information. She found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind. The humor emerged by accident, as it always did. They were in the library. She had taken to spending mornings there, having located it 2 days after his mention of it and found it the best room in the palace, high-ceilinged and disorganized in the comfortable way of a collection that has grown faster than anyone has been able to systematize it. He had arrived, as he now arrived, without announcement, and was reading something at the adjacent table when she made a sound. Not a laugh. Something more controlled than a laugh. The sound of a laugh being converted at the last second into a cough by a person who wasn't certain laughter was appropriate. He looked up. What? Nothing. She looked back at her book. What? He said again, with the flat patience of someone who intends to wait. She turned the book so he could see the page, an illustration in a pack history text, depicting the third Dravenmoor king in what the caption described as his famous battle stance, which bore a resemblance to someone who had been surprised by a door. Kael looked at it for a moment. That's supposed to be my great-grandfather. I know. It says so. He won 4 wars. I believe it, she said. The artist may not have been present. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific quality of a man producing something unfamiliar from a place he doesn't often access. The artist was present. According to the household records, my great-grandfather had him removed from the palace immediately afterward. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not exactly, but the architectural suggestion of one, the way a room suggests warmth before the fire is lit. She looked back at her book before she did something unguarded with her own face. He learned things about her in the way careful people learn things about careful people. Not through direct inquiry but through patient observation and the occasional precisely targeted question. He noticed the flinch before she could suppress it, on a morning when a senior attendant dropped a tray in the corridor outside the library, and she was on her feet and 3 steps toward the far wall before she had consciously processed the sound. He didn't comment on it. He filed it with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything she filed about him. He asked her once, in the courtyard, why she had come to Vaelthorn specifically, meaning Greymoor House, meaning the chain of events that had preceded it. She told him. Not everything, but the functional outline, her mother, her stepmother. The transaction that had ended with her at Greymoor House at 15 with nothing but the clothes she was wearing. She delivered it in the same register she delivered everything difficult, factual, and unornamented, and watched him receive it with the focused, careful attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. He didn't offer sympathy. She was grateful for this. Sympathy required a performance in response, a reassurance that she was fine, and she was tired of that particular exchange. He said, "How old were you when your mother died?" 7. He was quiet for a moment. "I was 11, he said, which was not a response she had expected, and which told her more than he had perhaps intended to tell her. She learned things about him in the same incremental way. The hybrid nature's cost was visible once she knew to look for it. The specific quality of exhaustion that preceded the moon by 3 days, the way he ate less and moved more carefully, and the crimson bled further into the silver gray of his eyes as the lunar cycle advanced. The court gave him more space during these days, which meant the spaces she had become accustomed to sharing with him were empty, and she found the emptiness more noticeable than she had expected to. She asked him on a quiet evening in the library. With the directness she had learned, he responded to better than circumlocution. "What does it feel like when you shift?" He went still in the way he went still when something had landed somewhere real. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. She was composing the quiet retreat that would allow them both to pretend she hadn't asked. When he spoke. "Like being translated," he said, "into a language that doesn't have words for the things the human part of me knows how to feel." He looked at his hands, at the permanent slight alteration in them that the hybrid blood produced even outside of shifts, the density of the bone structure visible beneath the skin, the way the tendons moved with something slightly more than human precision. The bone wolf side is old. It doesn't think in sentences. Thinks in weight, proximity, threat and not threat. He paused. The vampire side is the opposite. It's very precise. Catalogs everything. During the shift, they're both at full volume simultaneously, and I'm somewhere in the middle trying to exist in both of them at once. She listened without interrupting, the way she listened to everything, completely without preparing her response while he was still speaking. The moon makes the bone wolf side louder, he said. Loud enough that the rational part of me can't hold a shape. Can't hold a face. He looked up at her. Can't hold, he stopped. Recognition, she said quietly. Yes. He held her gaze. Except. She waited. You, he said. The word was flat and undecorated and landed with the specific weight of something he had been carrying for a while and had not found a way to put down. The bond is louder than the shift. I didn't know that was possible. Pause. I don't think it's supposed to be possible. She looked at him in the lamplight of the library. This man who was also a monster, who had spent 29 years being the thing that emptied rooms, who had just told her something she suspected he had never told another person. Has anyone ever asked you that before? She said. What it feels like. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. She nodded, looked back at her book, gave him the gift of not making it into a moment that required a response, because she understood what it cost to say a true thing out loud for the first time and she wasn't going to add weight to it. But something had settled between them in the library that evening. Not romantic, not yet, but something more fundamental than romance. The specific warmth of being known accurately by someone who looked directly at what you were and did not look away. She felt it in the bond's low, steady warmth, and for the first time since the East Wing, it didn't frighten her. She noticed the tiredness first. Not the tiredness she had carried since Greymoor House, the functional, manageable exhaustion of a person who had been surviving on inadequate resources for years and had simply adjusted her baseline accordingly. This was different in quality. It arrived in the mornings with a heaviness that didn't lift the way tiredness was supposed to lift, that sat behind her eyes and in her limbs with a patience suggesting it had no intention of leaving on its own schedule. She noted it, filed it under monitor, kept moving, because stopping to investigate every change in a body that had been through considerable upheaval in the past 2 months seemed like a use of energy she couldn't justify. Then came the mornings she couldn't eat. This was more difficult to file and move on from, because Moana had spent enough of her life in situations of genuine food scarcity that her relationship with available meals was not casual. She ate what was offered when it was offered, without exception, as a practice so ingrained it had stopped being a decision years ago. When she sat down to breakfast on the 3rd consecutive morning and found that the sight of the food produced something urgent and architectural in her body that had nothing to do with hunger, she set down her fork and sat very still for a moment and did the calculation she had been avoiding. She went to the palace healer that afternoon. His name was Osric, older than Edra, quieter, with the particular stillness of a man who has delivered enough significant news in his career that he has developed a practice around it. He examined her with professional thoroughness, asked questions she answered honestly, and then was quiet for a moment in a way that told her the quiet was not the absence of information but the presence of it being arranged. She watched his face. She was good at reading faces. What she found there was not horror. Not sympathy. Something more complex. The expression of a man encountering a medical reality he has no existing framework for and is attempting to construct one in real time. He looked, she thought, the way Edra had looked the morning after the marking. The specific quality of a person rearranging their understanding of the relevant structure. Her stomach dropped before he spoke. I need to ask you, he said carefully, about the nature of the bond, specifically whether... He paused, selecting his words with a precision that told her how much they mattered. Whether the bond was fully completed. In the initial encounter. She held his gaze steadily. Yes. He was quiet again. Longer this time. "What I'm about to tell you," he said, "has no precedent in any medical record I have access to. I want you to understand that before I say it, because the absence of precedent means the absence of a map, and you deserve to know that." He looked at her with the direct, careful honesty of a man who has decided that clarity is the only kindness available. "You are carrying a hybrid heir." The room was very still. She heard the words. She processed them with the part of her brain that processed everything. Methodically, systematically, checking them against what she knew and what she didn't know in the space between. The part of her that had survived Greymore House and stepmother transactions and council chambers and Sable's corridor assessment received this information and began, automatically, to calculate. She let it calculate for a moment. Then she stopped it. "Impossible," she said. Not a protest. A genuine inquiry. She wanted to know where the precedent broke. By every existing record, yes. Osric met her eyes. "And yet the evidence is not ambiguous." He paused. "The bond appears to have accommodated. In ways that have no medical explanation I can currently offer you." She sat with this for a long moment. Then she stood, thanked him with the quiet precision she brought to everything, and walked out of the healer's wing. She went to Kael. Not because she had decided this was the correct sequence of actions, but because her feet made the decision before her rational mind had finished its calculation, and she had learned enough about the bond in 2 months to recognize when it was navigating rather than her. She found him in his study, the private one, not the formal council room, the one she had been in twice before, with the window that faced west and the desk buried under territorial maps. He was always in the process of revising. He looked up when she entered, registered her face immediately. "Sit down," he said, which was the second time someone had said this to her today, and she sat because her legs had made her walk here and seemed to feel their responsibility discharged. She told him, directly, with the same factual register she used for everything that mattered. One sentence. She watched his face while she said it. He went still. Not the controlled stillness of the throne room, not the careful stillness of a man managing his public presentation. The deep, structural stillness of a person receiving something that has bypassed every layer of management and landed directly in the place where the unarmored self lives. His hands, flat on the desk over the territorial maps, did not move. His eyes stayed on her face. The silence lasted long enough that she began to construct the quiet acknowledgement she would offer him. "I understand. I don't expect anything. I will manage this as I have managed everything." The automatic preparation of a woman who had spent her life making her needs as small and undemanding as possible before anyone could ask her to. She didn't get to deliver it. "Nothing will touch you," he said. His voice was quiet, precise in the specific way of something that has been decided rather than said, that exists as a declaration of fact rather than an expression of intention. He stood from the desk in a single movement, came around it, and stopped in front of her, close enough that the bond's warmth registered in her sternum like a held note. "Nothing will touch them." His eyes held hers with a focus so complete she felt it as a physical thing. "I will burn this palace to the ground before I allow it." She looked at him, at this man who had spent 29 years being the thing that emptied rooms, who ruled 5 territories with the absolute precision of someone who had never in his life been required to be soft, who was standing in front of her in his study over his territorial maps with something in his face that had never appeared there in any public context she had observed. She didn't know what to do with it. This was the honest truth, and she sat with it rather than covering it, because she had learned in the library that honesty between them worked better than management. She had spent her entire life calibrating her expectations downward before anyone could disappoint them. She had built an entire survival architecture on the foundational premise that she was temporary in every room she occupied, that the reasonable anticipation for someone like her was removal, not protection. He had just used the word burn. "Kael," she said. He waited. "I don't know how to." She stopped. Tried again. "I'm not accustomed to." That wasn't right either. He crouched in front of her chair, which brought him to her eye level, which she understood was deliberate. The silver-gray eyes, close and focused and completely without the controlled distance of the throne room, looked at her with the patient quality he brought to things he intended to understand fully. "I know," he said quietly. "You don't have to know what to do with it right now." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm frightened," she said, which was true, and the most unguarded thing she had said to him yet. And she said it because the library had established that true things between them were survivable. "So am I," he said, which was, she suspected, the most unguarded thing he had ever said to anyone. They stayed like that in the quiet study for a while, the territorial maps spread over the desk behind him, the bond humming its low steady warmth between them, two people sitting inside an impossible fact and finding, to the surprise of both, that the other one made it slightly more possible to hold. The warning came from Dara. Not through official channels, not through any of the palace's formal information networks, but in the way that real warnings usually came, quietly, urgently, from someone with nothing to gain and something to lose by speaking. Dara found Moana in the library on a Tuesday morning and sat down across from her without being invited and placed both hands flat on the table and said, in a voice pitched below the range of the nearest occupied chair, "Don't drink anything you haven't watched poured from a sealed bottle. Don't eat anything that comes to you from outside the main kitchen. Don't let anyone into your rooms that you didn't ask for." Moana looked at her steadily. "How long have you known?" 3 days. Dara's jaw was tight. "I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. I've been trying to decide whether telling you made it better or worse, and I've decided it makes it better because you're—" She stopped. "You're good at knowing things. You'll be more careful than I am." "What did you hear?" Dara told her. Not everything. She had fragments, the partial architecture of a plan overheard through a door that had been assumed closed. "Enough. A compound," she said. "One of the old herbal preparations from before the territories were unified. The kind that left no traceable evidence in a postmortem because its effects mimicked natural causes. Something that could be introduced into food or drink. Something that would not harm an adult wolf but would, in sufficient concentration, end a human pregnancy." Moana sat with this for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right." Dara looked at her. "Thank you," Moana said, with the complete, genuine sincerity she reserved for things that actually mattered. "You took a risk telling me. I want you to know I understand that." She went back to her rooms and sat on the edge of the large bed and thought, with the methodical precision she brought to every bad situation, about what she had and what she needed and what the correct sequence of actions was. She thought about sending for Kael immediately. She thought about the particular quality of Kael's stillness in the study when she had told him about the air, and the specific weight of the word burn, and the way his eyes had been when he crouched to her eye level and said, "So am I." She thought about what he would do if she told him before she had anything concrete. What the hybrid blood did with a threat to its mate and heir, uncontrolled, before there was a specific target for it to address. She decided to be careful first and tell him second, when she had something that couldn't be denied or dismantled. She was good at being careful. It was the skill she had spent her whole life developing. She was careful for 4 days. On the 5th day, someone got past careful. She never fully reconstructed the sequence. What she knew afterward was this. The sealed bottle she had watched poured was not the one that reached her. A switch, somewhere in the kitchen corridor, executed with the elegant precision of Sable's best work. A single cup of tea, placed on her sitting room table by a staff member she had seen a dozen times, from a source she had verified, in a container she had checked. She noticed the smell when she lifted it. Not wrong exactly, close enough to right that it would have been undetectable to a human nose operating without specific suspicion. Her nose was human, but she had been told what to look for, and she had been looking for 3 days, and the smell was almost right in a way that almost right never was. She set the cup down without drinking. What happened in the next 10 minutes, she would later understand, involved 3 palace staff members she had never directly interacted with who had been, for reasons she hadn't known, quietly watching her corridors since the morning after the council chamber incident. Osric, who had apparently been watching Dara watch Moana and had drawn conclusions. And the bond. The bond was not quiet when it recognized a threat in proximity to the air. She felt it spike through her sternum like a struck chord. Not pain, not fear, something more primal than either. The specific alarm of something ancient and protective coming fully awake. She understood, sitting at her table with her hand still on the cup, that Kael would feel this. That it would reach him wherever he was in the palace with the specific quality of a signal he was constitutionally unable to ignore. She heard the corridor outside change 3 minutes later. Not footsteps. Something that moved faster than footsteps, with the ground-covering efficiency of a hybrid bloodline operating at the threshold of a shift. The specific sound of a man who has received a signal from his bond and is no longer entirely a man. The door opened. He took in the room, her sitting, the cup on the table. The staff member Osric had apparently intercepted in the corridor and was currently holding with a chemical-stained tray still in evidence. In a single assessment that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. His eyes were crimson at the edges. His hands were wrong in the specific way they went wrong when the bone wolf blood was very close to the surface. He crossed to her first. Not to the tray, not to the evidence. Not to the staff member who was currently making the sound of someone understanding how badly they had miscalculated their situation. To her. He put both hands on her face, careful, which cost him something given the state of his control, and looked at her with the focused, complete attention of someone performing an assessment that matters more than any other currently available assessment. "I didn't drink it," she said. Something moved through him, relief and fury simultaneously, in proportions she couldn't separate because they were occupying the same space. "I know," he said. His voice was very controlled in the way that things are controlled when the effort is enormous. "I'm going to need you to stay here." "I know," she said. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he stood and turned toward the corridor, and the quality of him as he turned was the thing the court would discuss afterward. The specific shift from the man who had just put careful hands on his mate's face to the king, who now walked into his own corridor with the absolute cold precision of something that had identified a threat and had no remaining interest in being reasonable about it. Sable was in the east corridor. Moana learned this later. She had apparently been positioned there to receive confirmation of success, and what she received instead was Kael Dravenmoor moving toward her with the velocity of a hybrid who has scented a threat to its mate and heir, and the specific coldness of a man who has no remaining capacity for the elegant and deniable. He didn't touch her. This was the detail that the court found most frightening afterward, that he had absolute capability and chose precision instead. He stopped in front of her and spoke in a voice that every warrior in the corridor could hear, that carried the specific quality of a royal declaration rather than a personal confrontation, and enumerated what had been attempted and what had been documented and what the consequence was. Not in anger. In the flat, complete certainty of a man issuing a verdict that does not require emotion because it requires only accuracy. Sable's composure lasted longer than most people's would have. She held his gaze and held her posture and held the beautiful constructed surface of her for approximately 30 seconds. Then something in the silver-gray eyes, something that reminded her and everyone watching that there was a bone-wolf hybrid behind them that was currently exerting considerable restraint, made the composure unsustainable. She looked away first. It was, in practical terms, a confession. Kael had her escorted from Vaelthorn territory before the hour was out. Not imprisoned, which she had perhaps expected, but removed with the thoroughness of someone being erased from a context. No ceremony. No public additional humiliation beyond the corridor, which had already been witnessed by enough people to constitute public. Simply gone, with the efficiency of a household removing something that no longer served any function. He came back to Moana's rooms when it was done. She was still sitting in the chair, the one she had initially been uncertain she was allowed to use, which had long since become simply her chair. She looked up when he came in. He crossed the room and sat in the adjacent chair, the one he had occupied on the first midnight visit, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her. The coldness was gone. Everything that had been in his face in the corridor, The precision, the control, the absolute contained fury of a hybrid operating at the edge of its restraint was gone, and what was underneath it was what Moana had been learning slowly to recognize. The court had seen it in the corridor before he turned away from Sable. The way he looked at Moana when he came back to her first. The specific quality of his face when the assessment of she's unharmed had registered and the control had cracked open for just a moment before closing again. They had seen what their monster king looked like when he loved something. He looked at her in the chair and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because some things had already been said in the corridor and in the study and in the library and in the accumulation of all the late nights and honest answers between them, and the quiet between two people who have been through something together is sometimes the most accurate language available. "Dara told me," Moana said eventually. "4 days ago." He was still. "You waited. I wanted something concrete. I was being careful." His jaw tightened once. "You were being careful?" he repeated, with the weight of a man who has just understood something about the person in front of him that he needs a moment to fully receive. "Alone. It's what I know how to do." "I know." He looked at her. "I know it is." A pause. "You don't have to anymore." She held his gaze and did the thing she had been slowly, incrementally learning to do in his presence. She let the words land without immediately calculating how much weight they could safely bear before she trusted them. She let herself believe, for one unguarded moment, that he meant exactly what he said. It was, she found, survivable. More than survivable. "All right," she said quietly. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. Not the gesture of a king, not anything formal or declarative. Simply a man taking the hand of the person he had walked very fast down a corridor to reach, and holding it with the careful, certain grip of someone who has decided they are not letting go. She didn't pull away. Outside the window, Vaelthorn Palace continued its evening. Inside the room, something settled between them that had been in the process of settling for 2 months. Quietly, incrementally, without announcement, the way the most real things tend to happen. He arrived in the early morning, in the blue hour before dawn when the palace was quietest and the torches had burned down to their last patient inch. Moana had been told, by Osric, by Edra, by every woman in the palace who had found occasion to offer her information over the preceding months, that she would know when it was time. This had seemed insufficiently specific to her, given her preference for concrete and actionable information, and she had said so to Kael on one of their late evenings in the library. He had looked at her with the almost smile she had learned to read and said that some things resisted being made into instructions, and she had accepted this with the particular grace of a woman who was learning, slowly, that not everything required a framework in advance. They had been right. She knew. Kael was there. He had arranged this months ago, with the quiet thoroughness he brought to things he considered non-negotiable. He would be present. The room would be Osric and Edra and no one else, and anyone who had council-based objections to this arrangement was welcome to raise them after the fact when he would be available to receive them with the full warmth the subject deserved. No objections had been raised. His court had developed, over the preceding months, a fairly accurate sense of which conversations were worth initiating. She did not remember all of it clearly afterward. What she remembered was the quality of the light changing from blue to gray to the first pale gold of dawn through the east window. Kael's hand, which she had held through the worst of it without planning to and which had held hers back with a careful, steady pressure that did not flinch once. Osric's voice, calm and precise and professionally untroubled by the fact that what was happening in front of him had no medical precedent. And then a sound small, immediate, and completely non-negotiable in the specific way that new sounds are, that rearranged the entire hierarchy of every other thing in the room. Osric placed him in her arms. She looked at him. He had Kael's bone-white hair, which was already dry and impossibly present, a full shock of it against her arm. Her own warm brown skin, which made the white of his hair more dramatic against it, a contrast that she suspected would be the first thing anyone who saw him noticed and the 10th thing she noticed because she was looking at his face. His eyes, when they opened briefly, with the unfocused interior quality of something still deciding where it was shifted between silver gray and dark in the specific way of something that contained more than one answer to the question of what it was. He was so small. She had known, intellectually, that he would be small. The knowledge had not prepared her for the physical reality of small, the impossible precision of his hands, the way his entire weight settled into the crook of her arm with a completeness that suggested he had always been intending to be there. She held him, and he was warm and solid and entirely, irrefutably real. She looked up. Kael was standing at the side of the bed looking at both of them with an expression that no court painter would ever capture accurately because it was not the kind of expression that held still long enough to be recorded. It moved, between the controlled silver-gray focus she had learned first and something underneath it that had no name in any language she knew, something that belonged to the place in a person where all the armoring ends. His eyes were fully silver. No crimson at the edges. The hybrid blood quiet in a way she had never seen it quiet before. He reached out and placed one careful finger against his son's hand. The tiny fingers closed around it with the reflexive certainty of something that recognizes what it belongs to. Something happened to Kael's face. She let him have it without comment, looking back down at the boy, giving him the same gift he had given her in the library when she had said something true for the first time, the grace of not making it into a moment that required a response. The ceremony was 3 days later. She had expected to feel more about the ceremony. She had spent months being aware of it as an approaching event of considerable significance. The formal acknowledgement, the council's reluctant and Kael-compelled acceptance, the public declaration that would make permanent and legal what the bond had made permanent and real months ago. She had thought she would feel the weight of it on the morning. What she felt on the morning was Kael sitting on the edge of her bed before the attendants arrived, in his informal clothes, the crown in his hands, looking at her with the silver-gray eyes that had learned over months to be warm. He turned the crown over once, set it on the coverlet beside him, looked at her. "I need you to know," he said, with the careful precision he brought to things that mattered, "that the crown is not why I want you." She waited. "I need you to know I understand the difference." He held her gaze steadily. "Between wanting someone because they are useful to what I am and wanting them because of who they are." A pause. "I didn't used to understand the difference. I understand it now." His jaw was slightly tight with the effort of saying something true in plain language without the armoring of formality. "You taught me that. I need you to know that I know it." She looked at him for a moment. This man, this monster, this hybrid king who had spent 29 years emptying rooms and 9 months learning that a room with one specific person in it was something entirely different from a room alone. Who had held her hand through the blue hour without flinching. Who had said burn and meant it and then proven it with a coldness in a corridor that his court would be discussing for years. She reached up and took his face in both her hands. He went still in the way he went still when something landed in the unarmored place, completely structurally all the way down. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He closed his eyes for a moment. One breath. Then he opened them and looked at her with the silver-gray eyes that were warm, that had learned to be warm, that she suspected no one who had known him before would recognize as belonging to the same face. "All right," he said, which was what she said when she meant something more than the words could hold, and he had learned this about her, and she knew he was using it deliberately, and the specific quality of being known accurately by someone who looked directly at what you were and did not look away settled into her chest like something finally, completely placed. The attendants came. The ceremony proceeded with the formal architecture of Vaelthorn tradition. The council present, the court assembled, the declaration made in the old language with the full weight of royal precedent behind it. Kael placed the crown on her head himself with both hands, and the court that had spent 3 days negotiating its feelings about a human queen and one unprecedented impossible heir fell into the silence of people witnessing something they don't have an existing category for. Then, one by one, they knelt. She stood in the throne room of Vaelthorn Palace with a crown on her head and looked out at a court that was not warm. Not entirely, not yet. These things took time and she had never expected otherwise, but that was kneeling. That was acknowledging. That was doing the thing that acknowledgement required regardless of comfort. It was enough. For now it was enough. That evening, After the ceremony and the formal dinner and the interminable sequence of introductions that protocol required, she found Kael at the east wing window. He was standing still, looking out at the moon with his hands loose at his sides and his face turned fully toward the light. Not braced, not managing, simply standing at a window on a moon night, in the east wing that had been evacuated without exception for 9 years, watching the silver light move across the courtyard below with the specific quality of a man looking at something that has lost its power to frighten him. She stood beside him. He didn't look away from the window, but his hand found hers in the dark, with the certain, quiet ease of something that had been practicing this for months and knew exactly where to reach. The moon rose over Vaelthorn Palace, full and enormously silver, and the east wing corridor was empty because it was a moon night and the staff had cleared it by habit. But the king was still there at the window, watching the light instead of running from it, holding the hand of the woman the Bond had chosen in a room where the world said nothing good could survive. Their son, 3 corridors away in the warmest room in the palace, slept with his bone-white hair against Moana's pillow and his hybrid eyes closed and his small hands open. Outside, the moon was very bright. Inside, the monster was entirely, quietly at peace.